Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning for this special presentation. We are very, very proud to have Sister Pat Tallon to join us this morning to speak about the Catholic Identity Statement. When I say Sister Pat brings a wealth of knowledge to us, it is amazing. She is a PhD, a consultant, a lecturer, a writer in the areas of mission, ethics, and formation. From 2003 to 2016, Sister Patricia was the Vice President for Mission Services at the Catholic Health Association of the United States. Having taught at every grade level from grades 3 through graduate school, Sister Patricia brings a broad educational background. She holds a PhD in theological ethics from Marquette University, an MA in religious studies from St. Charles Seminary, and a BA in humanities from Gwynedd Mercy College. She also spent a semester as a visiting fellow at Georgetown University's Kennedy Center of Ethics. Sister Pat, we are so happy to have you with us today to speak on this important topic. Before we begin, I would like to ask everyone to join us in a prayer for peace. I think that peace is such an important topic for what we need in our world today. So if you would join me. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called people of God, from Matthew. This is part of Paul's letter to the Colossians. You are God's chosen one, and God loves you. Clothe yourselves with heartfelt mercy, with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with one another. Forgive each other as soon as quarrels begin. The Lord has forgiven you. Now you must do the same. Over all these virtues, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. And may the peace of Christ reign in your hearts. It is for this that you were called together as parts of one body. Always be thankful. Let the message of Christ in all its richness find a home in you. Amen.
Amen.
Sister Pat, again, we are so proud to have you with us, and thank you for sharing your wealth of information with us. I will turn this over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Susan. And can you hear me all right?
Yes.
We can, yes, thank you.
Good, good. Before you even go on to the first slide, I want to comment because I'm looking at the names of several of the people that are on here, many of whom I at least have met, and some of whom I know quite well. And I want to say that I first gave this talk several years ago, or an iteration of this talk, at the Mesa conference in Atlanta when we were able to be together. And so actually it might have been like 2018. It was a while ago. And I have since given it at least twice, I think maybe three times, to other Mercy boards in various iterations or parts of the country. But this, and I have, so some of you, this is going to be a partial repetition, although there are portions of this which are new, partly because of changing times and also because of a recent teaching from the Vatican. So I wanted you to know that some of you might have heard part of this before. The other thing is that I want you to be aware of the fact that, and Susan said this, my expertise is that of a theologian or a theological ethicist. I'm not a canon lawyer. Obviously, I'm not a bishop or a priest. And so I am coming at this from the point of view of theology. And there are other ways to approach this topic. So I want to just acknowledge that. All right, Susan. I'm going to start with something, I mean, really that is very personal, because I find that often that which is most personal can sometimes be applicable. This is a picture of me on the day, and my cousins and my brother sort of halfway behind me on the day of my first communion. Catholic identity begins at a very, very young age, or at least a recognition of Catholic identity begins at a very young age. And I'm sure that many of you are aware of that within your own lives or within the lives of your children or perhaps even grandchildren. So this sense of Catholic identity is not something that is learned, but more, or rather, I think it is apprehended. The next picture is a picture of the church where I grew up, was baptized, made my first communion and my confirmation. It also happens to be the church where my grandfather was one of the founding families, and as much as he was able, was a benefactor to the building of this church. It's ironic because he was Italian, but this church was very Irish and was conceived. It's called St. Coman's, and it was conceived or tried to be built as a very tiny imitation of the church, St. Coman's Cathedral in Cobh, Ireland. But the important thing was that at that period of time, our lives, for most Catholics, our lives were very much parish centered on the school, on activities within the parish, sometimes membership of clubs within the parish. And so there was a real sense of life being centered within that context. Now, for our family, which, as I already revealed, was part Irish, part Italian, it was also, and Susan, you can move this on, it was also very meal-centered. And so there's the sense of gathering around the table. This is not a formal picture. It was the only one I could find of us sitting at the dinner table. It's not even, this is not a high feast. It's not a birthday. It's not Easter. This was, you can see there's no tablecloth even, but there's a large group of people that included multi-generational. An aunt and uncle are there. Cousins are present. What you can't see is there's another little table on the side where a couple of other people who didn't fit at the big table that day were at the smaller table. But the sense that the gathering around the table was something, my parents obviously never spoke of in the terms that this was something that was sacramental, but in fact it was sacramental. It was a sign of God's presence among us. It was a sense of committing to one another. You didn't not show up, first of all, because you were hungry, but you just really didn't not show up if you weren't hungry, and you didn't get up and leave the table unless you were given permission to do so, because there was a recognition that we are family. And even though at that table there may be differences, and this is just sort of a little aside, I'm looking at this table and I won't tell you who was who, but we all know that in this country there are two major political parties. And in my parents' and even within my extended family of aunts and uncles, we had both parties represented, and not only represented, but very vocal. And so sometimes the discussions at the table were rich with differences. And yet it was very, very clear that we loved one another and that we were family. Now, I want to put that in the background because ultimately Catholic identity starts with relationships. So, all right, Susan. However, we all know, you know better than I do, although I know even in my the little tiny area outside of Philadelphia where I live, when I look in my complex, I no longer live or worship or minister in a Catholic ghetto. That reality may have been a reality for some of us, but it has totally changed. There is tremendous diversity in my neighborhood, in the parish that I attended regularly before COVID. Now I mostly go attend liturgy at the Mother House, but there was tremendous diversity, racially, ethnically, even culturally. And when I say religiously, I don't mean just different religions, although you certainly have that present in your schools, but even within the way that families gather together, particularly for devotions or prayer or worship, and certainly socioeconomically. There are probably other ways that we are different that you could add to this. Susan? However, I think one of the things that we recognize, we certainly know you just have to pick up a newspaper, you have to just listen to the evening news, you have to tune in to different television stations or cable stations to know that this is the United States is a country that is politically divided. And because I'm aware that there are some of you on this call who are not simply from the United States, I would assert as well that the political or even ideological division that exists in many parts of the country exists many other places within this world. Gerald Arbuckle is a friend of mine. He is a Marianist priest. He has studied theology, but his doctorate is in social anthropology. And he's written a lot of books. Sometimes I tease him that he writes like one book a year, but he wrote a book on fundamentalism, and he wasn't talking about religious fundamentalism only, but sort of cultural and political fundamentalism as well. And he said that as society becomes more and more complex, and we certainly know that ours is very complex, people tend to seek for simple solutions to their challenges. They seek for simple answers. I saw this many times when I was working in healthcare and teaching residents and interns ethics. Many of them would carry around, I mean, this is the very beginning of iPhones or smartphones, and they'd be seeing a patient, and they'd be trying to go on their iPhone to try to find out what was wrong. And they wanted a simple yes or no, this is what's wrong. And of course, we recognize, and I used to repeat this over and over to them, medicine is not simply a science, it's also an art. And so too is education. Education is not simply a science, and you are not going to get simple answers to the queries that are presented to you from children or from others. Pope Francis also speaks about our responsibility to understand who we are as Christians and as Catholics. And he says it's important to ask ourselves certain questions about our Christian identity and our responsibility. And I want to emphasize that sense of responsibility as believers in a world that's marked by confusion and disappointment and frustration. We need to always ask, what's the basis of our mission? What is the heart of our mission? What are the essential approaches that we need to take to carry out our mission? Now, if you think in terms of the Sisters of Mercy, you can, the next slide, Susan. And even if you think in terms of our three vows, or fourth vow, pardon me, the fourth vow says that we are committed to that we take a vow of service to the poor, to the sick, and to the ignorant. Now, the poor, if you think then in terms of what I would call sort of divisions of Catholic ministries, the ministries of healthcare and of Catholic charities and of education fall very analogously to the three vows of the sisters, and therefore are an expression, I believe, of the charism of Catherine Macaulay. But I want to also mention that there are other ministries in the church that have advanced in our understanding. And just this morning early, I was reading through my Catholic, I get a news feed of Catholic, both Catholic and secular news each morning. And I saw that the Agnesian sisters, who are a group in northern, actually Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, I believe, is where their mother house is. But a group from Wisconsin have just dedicated almost 300 acres of their property in perpetuity so that it will not be divided and it can be maintained to help to support the environment. And so the notion of a ministry to the earth, which is part of the common good of the church's teaching, is something that has become a ministry, in fact, for some Sisters of Mercy and for other religious communities throughout the country. So what are the hallmarks of Catholic identity? In the document that you received and that is in the packet, I asked that it be resent because there are some of you who are new in this cohort. The Sisters of Mercy highlight in our discernment document some particular hallmarks of Catholic identity, and I will talk about some others in the next slide. But this one, in the Sisters of Mercy document or discernment document, we talk about gospel values, so those values that are in the scriptures, but particularly the New Testament. Catholic social teaching, which is a very specific body of teaching, means something very specific historically, which we can talk to, but it also has its roots in the Hebrew tradition. We talk about contemporary Catholic moral teaching, and then finally about the mercy documents. So those are some hallmarks or guidelines that you, as an expression of mercy education, can and should try to express. There are other ways of looking at this, and I want to mention a book called Caritas and Communion that was originally published in 2014 by the Catholic Health Association, and the author is Dr. Mary Therese Lysalt, who is a tenured professor at Loyola in Chicago. And she referred to this as Caritas and Communion, using that title. She took the title actually from the encyclical of Pope Benedict called Deus es Caritas, and which means God is love. And so if you think of this, I'm not creative enough computer-wise to do this myself, but if you think of each of these steps as circles and concentric circles, so at the very center is Caritas, or God. God is at the center of who we are. The next circle is Jesus Christ, who lived and taught among us. Next, Therese Lysalt has the charisms of the various religious congregations, and the Mercies are one of them, but you could also speak in terms of the charisms of Ignatius of Loyola, or certainly Francis of Assisi, or Louise de Marillac and Vincent de Paul, the charisms that were particular expressions of Christ and also of God's love. That extends out to the sense of ministry and evangelization, partly because when Jesus commissioned his apostles, he said, go. I mean, he didn't tell them to go back to the rooms and hide, but to go out and to bring this good news to others. Then the next circle is what is called Ecclesiology and Sacramentality. And that means ecclesiology was the founding of the church, but the church was not founded immediately at the time of the ascension. It was something that was founded through the continued growth of ministry and evangelization, and then the formation of the church as a universal presence, extending that good news to others, but also supported, upheld, and exemplified by the sacraments which form a part of our daily lives. And then finally, the Catholic social principles, which she has at the end, the last concentric circle, but that extends out then to the world. I mean, it's not meant to be exclusive, but it's meant to extend out. All right, Susan. So I want to say to you that being Catholic or being a Catholic institution is not belonging to a club. I don't know if you can, this picture that I have there may or may not explain it's, they're obvious. Now I'm too old to even have known to be a part of this, but it's certainly not a country club. It's not a fancy club in New York City where I can go to hear musicians or to have drinks and hobnob with the rich and famous. It's not a membership in something, again, like a private club or an organization. It is instead a communion or a community with the church. Now that this is something that I want to expand on this a little bit, because many people have commented on this. The Irish writer whom I love, James Joyce, one time never left the church, although he certainly wasn't a practicing Catholic for much of his lives. But he talked and someone said to him, what does it mean to be Catholic? And he said, well, here comes everyone. Meaning that within the Catholic reality, everyone is welcome. When you think in terms of universality, it's the rich and the poor, the sick and the healthy, the ignorant and those who are very, very learned. However, it's not simply this notion of, okay, the doors are open and those red lines are moved. It's not simply variety or diversity, but it is intended to be, it's not yet, whoops, Susan, not quite yet. It's intended to be a whole that interrelates and integrates. So it's clearly intended to be relational. And Joseph Komanchek, in a recent article, any of you who get America Magazine or America Online, there's an interview of Joseph Komanchek, who is probably the greatest teacher of ecclesiology in the United States. He's a retired priest, now lives in New York State. And he says that it's a particular cultures make a community a local church, but it's the word and the grace of God that is received in faith, hope, and love that makes a community a local church. So the apostolate then, or the work that we do together, is a service that requires unity and communion with the church. And this is obviously essential to Catholic identity and has to be exercised in communion with the church. And I want to say, just like if you think of that, the photo that I had there of our families at the dinner table, we were all smiling. Many times we were not all smiling at one another. And so that being a community is something that means that we work together. Okay, Susan, the next side, being a Catholic is not an either or. It's not that you've got to have totally divided and you pick this or you pick that, but it's always intended to be a both and. It's meant to be inclusive, to draw together and to work toward communion. And again, if you think of the teachings of Jesus, Jesus tried to teach this to his disciples many times through parables. When he spoke of the parable of the Good Shepherd or the prodigal son, they would be examples of going out. It's not like, not that I pick in the story of the prodigal son, which was just read recently. I mean, it was one of the readings at Sunday, I think 2 weeks ago, that the father is not saying, well, I'm going to take this son who has been lost, but he's not ignoring the other son. He's trying to hold the two of them together. And we'll talk about holding things together, sometimes in tension. All right, continuing on, Pope Benedict describes being Catholic as a relationship. He says, don't forget that being Christian is not the result of an ethical choice or a lofty idea. It's not philosophical, but it's the encounter with an event, a person, which gives life a new horizon and a decisive direction. And that is vitally important. It's not, for example, a Pew survey or an opinion poll. It's a relationship with the person of Jesus Christ. So being Catholic is, again, the notion of being, or at the next slide, Susan, relating to the triune God who is in relationship. Sister Pat Smith from Baltimore, whom I know some of you know, I remember her giving a talk one time when she talked about the Trinity. Someone said to her, sister, define the Trinity, which of course is a whole entire course in graduate school and you still can't do it. But Pat Smith responded beautifully. She said, our God is not a loner. We believe in one God, but three divine persons. And that triune God is in relationship. Now, in our own relationships, whether personal or ecclesial, we know that we need to work at those relationships, that there is a ebb and a flow in relationships. Sometimes there's things good, sometimes not quite so good. So it's never static. It involves communication, conversation, not walking away from the table. And often it involves creativity and new ways of thinking. And this is really, really, really important. Now, recently, the next slide, and I asked, Susan sent this to a copy of this to you just last week on March 29th. There was a document issued by the Congregation for Catholic Education in Rome. And I keep watching the New York Times and other news feeds that I receive, and they haven't caught on to this yet. And even the National Catholic Reporter has not, but I don't know, eventually they will. And I will be interested to see particularly how some news medias treat this document. And some of them are going to treat it like, okay, this is brand new. The church has never said anything like this before. So I wanted you to have a copy of it because I think you need to be informed, particularly if your local bishop mentions it, or if parents or faculty member, whatever, someone comes to you, you need to be aware of this. So I want to emphasize that it's an instruction, it's not law. So this is not something that is an encyclical. It's not for the entire church, it's for Catholic education. And so it's not law. And it also, if I may say, and this is my interpretation, although I have consulted with some experts in this regard, it doesn't represent any new teaching. And I think that's important for you to understand. It relates to Canon 803, which is in the Code of Canon Law. And in that canon, it says, and I'm quoting here, for his own diocese, the local ordinary has the right to appoint or approve teachers of religion, and even to remove them or demand that they be removed if a reason of religion or morals requires it. So that it stands right there. They also talk about teachers. They're not talking about teachers of religion. Now, I want to just go back to that statement about for his own diocese. Within Catholic healthcare, there's an analogous regulation in the ethical and religious directives for all Catholic healthcare institutions in the US that says that the bishop has the right to appoint the person who is the head of pastoral care in any Catholic hospital in his diocese. And in the beginning, there were people within Catholic healthcare who really got a little bit wigged out or concerned about that. And they said, well, does this mean the person has to be Catholic? Well, no, not necessarily. I can name for you many excellent heads of pastoral care who are Lutheran or Episcopalian. because their qualifications were better than that of some Catholics who might have been interested in the same position. And frankly, also because it's hard to get people to be the heads of pastoral care. There's a scarcity of people qualified to do that. So the bishop has the right to appoint that person, but that does not mean that that person has to be in lockstep with the bishop in every single way. So I want to just kind of mention that there is something analogous in another church ministry. Now, there are some sections of this document that I think are really important. It talks about the church as mother. I think it's always interesting how they use the feminine to think in terms of the church. So the church is our mother, but also our teacher. And therefore, because the church is a teacher, education is central to its mission. They talk in terms of a culture of care, and there are many reasons for that. I mean, you can read, I'm not going to read the document to you, but I think it's important that you are aware of that. And we're not talking here only about with regard to sexual abuse, but it's based on the sense of the dignity of the human person and respect for every person, including children. They also talk in terms of the fact that there needs to be dialogue within the community. And that doesn't mean just the community of a specific school, but it means the community in which it functions, the community, the recognition of the impact of the organization on a broader sense than just the people that are within the walls of that school, and obviously within the faith community in which it resides. And that faith community may, in fact, include other denominations that also share some proximity for whatever reason with that organization. Now, this is probably a poor analogy, but just when I logged in, I got on a little bit earlier, and there were a few people on, and they were talking to Susan and Kim about Villanova's loss. And those of us that live in Philadelphia, I mean, was a huge thing. And the recognition that although not everyone in this area, of course, is Catholic, not everyone is even a graduate of Villanova, but the impact and the pride that the sense of teamness has had in this community can't be underestimated. Now, someone just wrote a comment. I know they were missing their major player. That was like huge news, of course, here. The document also does draw boundaries and says, particularly when talking about teachers, that behaviors that are not in keeping with the church or with the teaching of the church are not acceptable, if you will, that they may not be tolerated. And I want to say that moral life in accord with the church's teaching has to be dealt with in a case-by-case basis. And I also want to say that I think the best way to handle it, and we'll come back to this a little bit, is with respect to the individual and respect to a sense of privacy, and not jumping immediately, as we tend to do, sadly, onto Twitter or Instagram. I don't think that I'm really up on all the next steps, but that's not how you handle differences, but you sit down in dialogue and handle the differences in that way. Now, Catholic identity in the Mercy tradition, which is a document that you received and is part of your packet, talks about Mercy education systems of the Americas and the schools that are their member institutions. That is intended to be a pastoral document. It is not juridical, it's not law, it's not legislative. It requires balance, and I'm going to come to that in a little bit. And it also requires discernment, and that's why you receive with it the discernment document. The document itself expresses a concern for the individual And that individual may be the student, it may be an individual teacher, parent, it's someone within the context of community for that institution, but it also expresses a concern for the common good. And that's another tension that our society struggles with, and even I believe the church struggles with, that each of us individually struggles with, that we need to really sit down and discern and discuss to make the right kinds of decisions. There are within the document, when I say possible challenges in the document, and I'm talking here particularly about the Document of Mercy tradition, but it relates back to that other earlier document of that came from the Vatican. I think, frankly, for me, the biggest challenge is being a part of the local faith community, continuing to relate well with the bishop, with parishes, with the people in the area. And it's essential to build these relationships all the time. The role of the head of school, the leaders that go out, this is part of your role. The building of relationships, the making of connections, the networking, the being on various boards or committees. And communication, continual communication is vital, so that I don't simply pick up the phone to either Mesa or to the diocese when something is wrong, but there is communication that is a two-way process all the time. Now, another thing that could be a possible challenge in the document is the very clear commitment to non-discrimination in hiring. And we can talk about that, and I'm sure you have talked about that, but I don't want to focus only on that, because I think really the building of community, the differences, political differences, if you will, racial differences, those often come to the foreground more quickly, I think. And I think sometimes we can ignore them. So the non-discrimination in hiring could create challenges, but I think it also creates opportunities in conversations and relationships. And remember, this is an ongoing, if you will, I don't want to say battle, but it certainly is an ongoing process. Now, the next picture is a map. And this is something, the Sargasso Sea is a, it's actually, they refer to it as a separate sea. It's a body of water that is located in the Atlantic Ocean. And it's actually between four major Atlantic currents. I'm not going to be able to repeat. One is the North Atlantic Current. One is the Gulf Stream. One is the stream that comes from the Canary Islands. And I think the fourth one comes from South America, but I'm not positive. And one of the problems, it's something that has been written about in history and in literature, because it's a portion of the ocean, first of all, that's marked by very large deposits of kelp or seaweed that were problems in the olden days for ships that had difficulty going through them. It's also a problem because oftentimes the sea is very calm. And yet you don't know what's going on underneath. And it is a place where, frankly, there have been hundreds and hundreds of shipwrecks since transatlantic journeys began to be taken. So I put this in here because I think sometimes this is where you find yourself. You're there where you've got all these currents moving against you or rubbing against each other, and you're trying to maintain balance and equilibrium and remain sort of afloat and kind of continuing to move ahead. You don't want to be static as well either. And this is something that I think this notion of that balance, Susan, you can move on to the next slide. This balance is something that Catherine Macaulay lived and experienced. She connected the rich to the poor, the healthy to the sick, the learned to those who needed education, and the influential persons in her community or her sphere with those persons who were most powerless. Catherine continually looked, again, not at an either or, but at a both and. But as I said, all of this requires balance. And if you look at the next slide, we balance, I'm conscious of this because in my old age, balance is an issue with me, and I have to keep going back to physical therapy for this. So we need to maintain balance, or sometimes in healthcare, what is called equipoise. You as leaders within your organizations and as persons on the board need to maintain balance between your executive function and the notion of servant leadership, between being an insider and being an outsider to some extent, and between upholding Catholic identity and ecumenical hospitality. And this requires a great deal of you. It requires thoughtfulness, reflection, conversation. I think it requires prayer and a continual going back to what is the center of your commitment to education and to the educational ministry. We need, all right, the next slide. We need to embody our beliefs. So all of you are either administrators, leaders, or board members for educational institutions. And yet sometimes we act as if that word institution is a dirty word. It's not a 4-letter word, but we treat it like it is. And there was a recent article in the National Catholic Reporter by Michael Sean Winters, whose articles are really very insightful. And he said the church is institutional because humans create institutions. What's more, and this part is really vital, the church is the body of Christ. And just so, if our great distinctive belief in the incarnation of God in Jesus Christ is to continue in humanity or in human history, we must necessarily incarnate our faith. In this life, Christ needs our hands to be his hands when he seeks to heal. And I think that is, to me, it's very, very important. He also quotes another ecclesiologist, Massimo Borghese, Massimo Fagioli. No, he quotes Massimo Borghese, because I'm looking at my notes here, and who talks about the fact that the attention and respect that Archbishop Vigano, who is an extremist on the right in the Catholic Church, has gathered from many of the American clergy and laity can be understood only within a framework that permeates much of American Catholicism. And that is the notion of culture wars and end time struggle. And I know some of you are facing this with parents of your children. So they speak in terms of almost the children of light and the children of darkness. And the notion that we have to work towards some kind of purity that is frankly far more Puritanism than it is Roman Catholicism. Roman Catholicism has the sacrament of reconciliation. We recognize that we are sinners all the time. And so within the mercy tradition, the next slide, I think you do have responsibilities as leaders within your organizations. You need to continually educate yourself. And I know that MESA is through, I love the MESA communication bulletin that, I mean, I think it's among the best in the Institute. And you need to educate yourself through that. You need to educate yourself about your local church. You need to listen to one another, and you need to listen to voices that are different from your own. Every now and then I force myself to listen to a television channel that will remain unnamed because I think I need to know what's going on. I force myself to read one of the Catholic periodicals, I do this on a daily basis, a Catholic periodical with which I almost 100% do not agree. And every now and then when I do find a column there where I agree, it's like, oh goodness. You need to communicate. You need to express your truth to one another, to those people to whom you are responsible. The other thing I want to emphasize with you is that you should be very careful about ensuring that there are no surprises. Incidents happen with unbelievable rapidity in this social media age, but you need to communicate with MESA. You need to communicate with one another. You need to communicate with the parents, and obviously with your students and with your teachers. And you need to continually look for opportunities for dialogue. And when I say opportunities for dialogue, so many times, I remember a bishop, this is in one of my healthcare experiences, a bishop saying to me, well, I was at a cocktail party and someone came up to me and they complained about something. And I'm sitting there thinking, a cocktail party is not the appropriate time or place for that. I mean, if I were the bishop, I would have said, I appreciate your concern, but you make an appointment? Could we talk about this at another time? However, there are opportunities. All of you are involved in spheres that go beyond your individual educational institutions. So whether it's another board, whether it's social engagements, meeting other people, there are opportunities for dialogue, and you need to seize those opportunities because it enables you to build yourself. But I think it also builds the strength of the organization or the institution. I'm trying to think before we, all right, if we move to the next slide, I want to just explain this. This is not questions for discussion now. I would like you, and this is the one that I think you received to take to your local areas. Something that I think should be discussed at the board level for sure, but definitely at the administrative level, is what are concrete ways that you have to maintain communion with the church. And I'm not talking simply about dialogue. Like, are you involved in any diocesan activities? Are there things, how many of your students or even families might be involved in diocesan synods if they are occurring? They're not occurring as much as they should throughout the United States, but they are occurring even in other areas. I think that actually, I would hope that in the church in Guam and the Philippines, you might be more involved. But what are the ways that you have to maintain communion with the church? And many times it's through local groups, through meeting with local people within the presbyterate. It's through the clergy persons whom you may invite to come to pray with and to share with your community. Secondly, I want you to talk about what are some of the challenges in your own particular educational ministry. And I remember with the ethics committee, talking with a group of people, these were mostly either heads of school or other executives within school. And one person spoke up and she said, the LGBTQ question is important, but if we spend all our time on that, I don't want to be on this committee, because the bigger issue for me, frankly, is racism and the racial issues, and how do we identify them? Someone else said, yes, that's important, but what is also important to me is what I would call economic disparities and the tension, the social tensions that creates within, in this case, it was high school students. So the last question that I want you to talk about, this is probably the most important that I think you need to discuss, is how can you and your local community deal with these issues, the challenges, preventively? I want you to engage in what I call preventive medicine. And you need to look and say, all right, this is something that has been happening. For example, maybe that has happened in other places, other schools in our area. in other schools within the Mercy circle? And what do we do when this occurs here? Because it probably will. And it's better to be prepared ahead. One of the things I want to say, this is my own opinion. So, and the other sisters, I mean, I can see some of the other sisters that are on this call, and I certainly welcome you disagreeing with me, although I think I'm still right in this. But I think the Sisters of Mercy as a group tend to be not as good as we could be in this area, because by our very charism, we tend to be more responsive than we do preventive or deliberative. We are so used to responding to the need at hand. And in our current culture, those needs keep coming at us with such rapidity that we simply spend the time to be responsive. And therefore, we're not being as strategic as we could be in saying, how do we get out ahead of these situations or problems? Now, I'm going to stop there